My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. 2 months ago, I received a handwritten letter that would completely change everything I thought I knew about my life's work. The letter came from a 16-year-old autistic girl named Sarah, and by the time I finished reading it, I was sobbing at my kitchen table. What she told me wasn't just urgent, it was earth-shattering. This is the story of how one letter revealed a secret that had been hidden for decades, and how sometimes the most powerful voices come from the people society overlooks the most. Before I share this remarkable story with you, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel. I tell stories about unexpected connections, about the power of listening to voices that are often ignored, and about how life can surprise us in the most profound ways. If you believe that every person has something important to say, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. My name is Eleanor Hartford, and I'm 73 years old. I'm sitting here in my study in Boston, Massachusetts, surrounded by the awards, photographs, and memorabilia from a career that spanned 45 years in corporate communications and public relations. For most of my professional life, I believed I understood my legacy. The campaigns I'd created, the companies I'd helped build, the messages I'd crafted that reached millions of people. 2 months ago, a single handwritten letter shattered that understanding completely and revealed a truth so profound that it's taken me weeks to find the courage to share it with anyone else. The letter came from a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Chen, and it began with 5 simple words that would haunt me for days. Can you read this letter? It's urgent. What followed was 8 pages of careful, deliberate handwriting that told me a story I never could have imagined. A story about autism, about corporate responsibility, about unintended consequences, and about how sometimes the most important work of our lives happens without us ever knowing it. But to understand why Sarah's letter affected me so deeply, you need to understand who I was before I received it, and how I built a career that I thought was all about helping businesses communicate better with the world. I started working in corporate communications in 1978, fresh out of college with a degree in journalism and dreams of changing the world through better storytelling. The landscape was very different then. Women in business were still fighting for basic respect and recognition. Corporate social responsibility was barely a concept, and the idea that businesses should consider their impact on vulnerable populations was radical thinking. I was hired by Morrison & Associates, a small public relations firm in downtown Boston that specialized in helping technology companies explain their products to mainstream audiences. In those days, computers were mysterious boxes that only experts understood, and my job was to translate complex technical concepts into language that ordinary people could grasp. I was good at it, really good. I had a talent for finding the human story in every product, for identifying the emotional connection that would make people care about innovations that might otherwise seem cold and impersonal. Within 5 years, I was running my own department and working with some of the biggest names in the emerging tech industry. But it was in 1985 that I took on the project that would define my career, though I wouldn't understand its true significance for nearly 4 decades. The client was called Neuralink Industries, not to be confused with the modern company of the same name. This was a small Boston-based firm that was developing what they called cognitive enhancement systems, essentially early versions of what we now know as assistive technology for people with developmental disabilities and learning differences. The company's founder, Dr. Marcus Hoffman, was a brilliant neuroscientist who believed that technology could help people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other conditions achieve their full potential. His products were revolutionary for their time. Computer programs that could help children with autism learn to communicate, devices that could assist people with ADHD in organizing their thoughts, systems that made it possible for individuals with various cognitive differences to participate more fully in education and employment. But Dr. Hoffman was a scientist, not a communicator. He could explain how his products worked in technical terms, but he struggled to convey their human impact in ways that would attract investors, convince schools to adopt them, or persuade insurance companies to cover them. That's where I came in. When Dr. Hoffman first walked into my office in September 1985, he was a man on a mission, but also a man in despair. He had developed technology that could genuinely transform lives, but he was running out of money and couldn't get people to understand what he had created. "I need someone who can help me tell the story," he said during our first meeting. Not the technical story, I can do that. I need someone who can explain why this matters, why it's worth investing in, why it's worth fighting for. He showed me demonstrations of his products, and I was immediately captivated. I watched children who had never spoken use his communication devices to express complex thoughts. I saw teenagers with severe ADHD successfully complete tasks that had been impossible for them before. I witnessed adults with autism spectrum disorders gainfully employed in jobs that utilized their unique strengths while accommodating their challenges. But more than the technology itself, I was moved by Dr. Hoffman's passion and his vision. He genuinely believed that society's approach to cognitive differences was fundamentally flawed, that instead of trying to fix people to fit into existing systems, we should create systems that could accommodate and celebrate different ways of thinking. This was radical thinking in 1985. The prevailing approach to autism and other developmental differences was still largely institutional. People were labeled as disabled and often segregated from mainstream society. Dr. Hoffman was proposing something entirely different, that cognitive diversity could be an asset if properly supported. I spent weeks researching his work, interviewing the families who were using his products, and documenting the outcomes he was achieving. What I found was nothing short of extraordinary. Children who had been written off by educational systems were thriving. Adults who had been considered unemployable were succeeding in challenging careers. Families who had been told to expect the worst were discovering hope and possibility. My job was to take these stories and craft them into a narrative that would convince skeptical investors, cautious educators, and conservative insurance executives that Dr. Hoffman's work deserved their support. The campaign I developed was called Unlocking Potential: Technology for Every Mind. It included video testimonials from families, case studies from schools that had adopted the technology, and economic analyses showing the long-term benefits of investing in cognitive accessibility. But the centerpiece of the campaign was something I called The Future We're Building, a presentation that painted a vision of a world where cognitive differences were accommodated and celebrated rather than stigmatized and marginalized. I presented this vision to corporate boards, educational committees, and policymakers. I wrote articles for business magazines, spoke at conferences, and created marketing materials that reached thousands of decision-makers across the country. The campaign was incredibly successful, more successful than any of us had dared to hope. Within 2 years, Neuralink Industries had secured major investment funding. Their products were being adopted by school systems nationwide, and Dr. Hoffman was being hailed as a pioneer in assistive technology. I was proud of the work we had done, but I also moved on to other clients and other projects. That's how consulting works. You solve a problem, achieve the objectives, and then focus your attention elsewhere. I maintained a casual friendship with Dr. Hoffman over the years, following his company's growth and celebrating his continued innovations. But Neuralink was just one success story among many in my expanding portfolio. Over the next 3 decades, I built a reputation as one of the leading communications strategists in the technology sector. I worked with dozens of companies, helped launch hundreds of products, and played a role in shaping public perception of everything from personal computers to the early internet. I specialized in what I called humanizing innovation, finding ways to make complex technologies accessible and appealing to mainstream audiences. My approach was always to focus on the human story, to identify the emotional connection that would make people care about products that might otherwise seem intimidating or irrelevant. The work was intellectually challenging and financially rewarding. By the time I retired in 2018, I had built a successful firm, mentored dozens of younger professionals, and created campaigns that had influenced public opinion on major technological and social issues. But if I'm being honest, as I got older, I began to feel a nagging sense that something was missing from my career. I had been successful by conventional measures: money, recognition, professional advancement. But I wondered if I had made a meaningful difference in the world. The technology industry had changed dramatically during my career, becoming more focused on profit and scale than on human impact. Many of the companies I had worked with in later years were primarily concerned with market share and stock prices, not with how their products affected people's lives. I began to feel like I had spent decades helping companies sell products rather than solve problems. The idealism that had driven me when I first worked with Dr. Hoffman seemed to have gotten lost somewhere along the way. This sense of disconnection became particularly acute during the pandemic, when I was isolated at home and had time to reflect on my career and its legacy. I found myself wondering whether the work I had done had truly mattered, whether I had contributed something of value to the world, or simply helped wealthy corporations become wealthier. It was during this period of reflection and, frankly, mild depression that I began receiving emails from people I had worked with over the years. Former clients reaching out to thank me for campaigns that had helped their companies succeed. Younger professionals crediting me with inspiration and mentorship that had shaped their careers. Industry colleagues acknowledging the influence my work had had on their approaches to communication and storytelling. These messages were gratifying, but they still felt somehow incomplete. They spoke to professional success and industry impact, but not to the deeper question that was haunting me. Had I made a difference in people's actual lives? That question was still weighing on me 2 months ago, when I received a package in the mail that would answer it in ways I never could have anticipated. The package was addressed in careful, deliberate handwriting to Eleanor Hartford, communications consultant. There was no return address, but the postmark indicated it had been sent from Springfield, Massachusetts. Inside was a manila envelope containing a handwritten letter and several photocopied documents. The letter began, "Dear Ms. Hartford, my name is Sarah Chen, and I am 16 years old. I have autism spectrum disorder, and I have been using assistive technology for most of my life to help me communicate, learn, and work toward my goals. I'm writing to you because I believe you played a role in creating the world that made my life possible, and I think it's urgent that you understand what your work meant to people like me. Please don't throw this letter away. I know it's unusual to receive handwritten letters from teenagers you don't know, but I had to reach out to you directly because what I have to tell you is too important to say in an email or a phone call. I need you to know that you saved my life, and I need you to understand how you did it. Can you read this letter? It's urgent that you do." I sat down at my kitchen table and continued reading, my hands already beginning to tremble with emotion I couldn't yet understand. "Ms. Hartford, I have spent months researching the history of assistive technology for people with autism and other cognitive differences. I'm working on a project for my senior thesis about how technology has changed the lives of people like me, and your name kept appearing in my research in ways that seemed too important to ignore. I discovered that in 1985, you created a marketing campaign for a company called Neuralink Industries that helped bring assistive communication technology to mainstream attention. The campaign was called Unlocking Potential, Technology for Every Mind, and it convinced schools, insurance companies, and government agencies to support technologies that helped people with autism and other conditions communicate and learn more effectively. What you probably don't know is what happened because of that campaign over the next 40 years. Ms. Hartford, your work didn't just help one company succeed. It started a revolution in how society thinks about cognitive differences and what people like me are capable of achieving. The technologies that Neuralink developed and that your campaign helped promote became the foundation for the assistive communication systems that millions of people use today. The arguments you made in 1985 about the value of accommodating different ways of thinking became the intellectual framework for the disability rights movement that followed. The vision you articulated, of a world where cognitive differences are accommodated and celebrated rather than stigmatized, became the reality that people like me grew up in. I am writing to you from that reality. I am a 16-year-old girl with autism who is taking advanced placement courses in high school, who has been accepted to MIT for early admission, who has already published research in computational linguistics, and who plans to spend her career developing the next generation of assistive technologies. None of this would have been possible in the world that existed before your campaign. None of this would have been imaginable to families like mine before you helped change how society thinks about people like me. But there's more to this story that I need you to understand. I paused in my reading, already overwhelmed by what Sarah was telling me. I had remembered the Neuralink campaign as a successful project from early in my career, but I had never considered its long-term impact or connected it to the broader changes in how society approached cognitive differences. But Sarah wasn't finished. The next several pages of her letter detailed a story that was even more extraordinary than what she had already shared. Ms. Hartford, I need to tell you about my family and how we discovered your role in our story. My mother, Dr. Linda Chen, is now a leading researcher in autism spectrum disorders at Boston Children's Hospital. But in 1987, when she was 8 years old, she was a non-speaking autistic child who had been written off by the educational system. Her parents, my grandparents, had been told to prepare for a lifetime of institutional care. Then my grandmother heard about new communication technologies that were being developed for children like my mother. These were the technologies created by Neuralink Industries, the same company you had worked with. My grandmother fought to get the school system to try these technologies with my mother, and everything changed. For the first time in her life, my mother was able to communicate her thoughts, express her needs, and demonstrate the intelligence that had been trapped inside her silence. The success my mother had with assistive communication technology convinced her teachers to provide additional accommodations and support. She was moved from special education classes to mainstream classrooms. She excelled academically throughout elementary and middle school. She went on to attend Harvard University, where she earned degrees in psychology and neuroscience. Today, my mother is one of the leading experts in the world on autism spectrum disorders. She has published over 100 research papers, developed new therapeutic interventions, and helped thousands of families navigate the challenges and celebrate the strengths of autism. But Ms. Hartford, here's what I need you to understand. My mother's story is not unique. When I started researching the history of assistive technology, I discovered that there are thousands of people whose lives were transformed by the technologies that your campaign helped bring to market. There are engineers, scientists, artists, teachers, entrepreneurs, and innovators who are autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, or have other cognitive differences. Many of them are successful today because the assistive technologies you helped promote gave them access to education and opportunities that previous generations never had. We are living proof that your vision of a world that accommodates and celebrates cognitive diversity wasn't just marketing rhetoric. It became reality for people like us. But I'm not writing to you just to say thank you, though I am deeply grateful. I'm writing because I discovered something else in my research that I think you need to know. The letter continued with information that left me stunned and questioning everything I thought I understood about corporate responsibility and unintended consequences. Ms. Hartford, while I was researching the history of assistive technology, I also discovered what happened to Neuralink Industries after your successful campaign. The company grew rapidly throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies and expanding into international markets. Dr. Hoffman remained committed to his original vision of using technology to support cognitive diversity, but as the company got larger, other priorities began to take precedence. In 2003, Neuralink Industries was acquired by a large pharmaceutical corporation that was primarily interested in their data collection capabilities rather than their assistive technologies. The new owners shifted the company's focus away from cognitive accommodation and toward what they called cognitive normalization, using technology to make neurodivergent people appear more typical rather than supporting their unique strengths. Worse, the pharmaceutical corporation began using the data collected from assistive technology users to develop and market medications aimed at correcting cognitive differences. They took the technologies that had been designed to celebrate and accommodate autism, ADHD, and other conditions, and turned them into tools for identifying potential customers for pharmaceutical interventions. Dr. Hoffman fought against this shift, but he was ultimately forced out of the company he had founded. The assistive technologies continued to be produced and sold, but the vision of cognitive diversity as a strength was replaced by a medical model that treated it as a problem to be solved. Ms. Hartford, I'm telling you this not to make you feel guilty, but because I think you have the right to know how your work has been used and misused over the decades. The campaign you created in 1985 did help launch a revolution in assistive technology that has transformed millions of lives for the better. But it also created a business model that has been exploited by people who don't share your original vision of cognitive diversity as a strength. Today, Many families are pressured to use assistive technologies not as tools for accommodation and communication, but as stepping stones toward pharmaceutical interventions designed to make their children more normal. The celebration of cognitive diversity that was central to your original campaign has been replaced by a medical approach that treats differences as disorders to be eliminated. I want you to know this because I believe you have the power to help us reclaim the original vision. At this point in the letter, I had to stop reading and take a break. The implications of what Sarah was telling me were overwhelming. I had created a campaign that was intended to promote acceptance and accommodation of cognitive differences. But that campaign had also inadvertently created a framework that could be used to exploit and marginalize the same people it was meant to help. The success of the Neuralink campaign had indeed launched a broader movement toward assistive technology and cognitive accommodation. But like many successful ideas, it had also been co-opted by people with different agendas and used in ways I had never intended or anticipated. I was proud of the positive impact the campaign had had on people like Sarah and her mother, but I was also horrified by the ways it had been twisted to serve corporate interests that were fundamentally opposed to the values I had tried to promote. When I returned to the letter, Sarah's final pages contained both a challenge and an opportunity that would change the direction of my life in retirement. Ms. Hartford, I am writing to you because I believe you can help us fight back against the misuse of your original vision. There is a growing movement of autistic people, ADHD individuals, and others with cognitive differences who are working to reclaim assistive technology from the medical model that treats us as problems to be solved. We want to return to the original vision of cognitive diversity as a strength, and we want to develop technologies that accommodate and celebrate our differences rather than trying to eliminate them. We need someone with your experience and credibility to help us tell our story. We need someone who understands how to communicate complex ideas to mainstream audiences, who knows how to influence corporate and policy decisions, and who has the professional standing to be taken seriously by investors and institutions. Most importantly, we need someone who shares our vision and our values, someone who believes that cognitive diversity is a strength rather than a weakness, someone who understands that accommodation is better than elimination. Ms. Hartford, I researched your career extensively before writing this letter. I know that you built your reputation on humanizing innovation, on finding the emotional connections that make people care about technological change. I believe that our movement needs exactly those skills. We are not asking you to come out of retirement to work for free. We have funding from foundations and advocacy organizations that want to support this effort. What we're asking is for you to consider joining us in creating a new kind of communications campaign, one that puts the voices and experiences of cognitive diverse people at the center of the conversation about assistive technology. We want to create a campaign that challenges the medical model that treats us as broken, that promotes the original vision of cognitive diversity as a strength, and that encourages the development of technologies designed by and for neurodivergent people rather than imposed upon us by others. I am including with this letter some materials that will give you a better sense of what we're working toward. There are research papers about the current state of assistive technology, personal stories from people whose lives have been changed by both good and bad applications of these technologies, and a preliminary proposal for the kind of campaign we envision. Ms. Hartford, I know this is an unusual request from a teenager you've never met, but I also know that you are the person who helped create the world that made my life possible. You have the power to help us protect that world and make it even better for the next generation. Please read the materials I've enclosed. Please consider what I'm asking. And please contact me if you're willing to discuss this further. This is urgent because every day that passes, more families are being pressured into medical interventions they don't want or need. Every day, more autistic people are being told that their differences are defects to be corrected rather than strengths to be celebrated. You helped start this revolution 40 years ago. We need your help to complete it. Can you read this letter? Can you help us? With hope and gratitude, Sarah Chen. At the bottom of the letter, Sarah had included her email address, phone number, and a note that she would be checking her email daily for a response. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after finishing the letter, crying tears that I couldn't fully explain. Sarah's story had revealed aspects of my career's legacy that I had never imagined. The work I had done in 1985 had indeed changed the world, but in ways both wonderful and troubling that I was only now beginning to understand. The materials Sarah had enclosed told the complete story of how assistive technology for cognitive differences had evolved over the past 4 decades. There were research papers documenting both the tremendous benefits these technologies had provided and the concerning trends toward medicalization and normalization. There were personal stories from dozens of individuals whose lives had been transformed by assistive technology, people who had gone on to achieve remarkable things precisely because their cognitive differences had been accommodated rather than eliminated. But there were also stories from families who felt pressured to use technology as a pathway to pharmaceutical interventions they didn't want. Most importantly, there was a detailed proposal for a new kind of advocacy campaign, one that would put the voices and experiences of neurodivergent people at the center of conversations about assistive technology. The proposal outlined strategies for challenging the medical model, promoting cognitive diversity, and encouraging the development of technologies designed to accommodate rather than eliminate differences. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Sarah was right. This was indeed urgent work that needed someone with my skills and experience. The original vision I had helped articulate in 1985 was being lost, and it would take a coordinated communications effort to reclaim it. But more than that, I realized that this was the meaningful work I had been searching for in retirement. This was my chance to use 4 decades of professional experience not just to help a company succeed or a product launch, but to fight for values I deeply believed in and to protect people who needed advocates. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about the current state of assistive technology, the neurodiversity movement, and the organizations working to promote cognitive accommodation. What I discovered confirmed everything Sarah had told me and convinced me that her request was not just urgent, but necessary. I called her on a Thursday evening, my hands shaking as I dialed the number she had provided. "Sarah Chen," she answered, her voice clear and confident. "Sarah, this is Eleanor Hartford. I received your letter and I've read all the materials you sent." There was a pause, and then I heard what sounded like a sharp intake of breath. "Ms. Hartford, you're calling me? You read everything?" "I read everything," I confirmed. "And Sarah, I want you to know that your letter is the most important piece of communication I've received in my entire career. What you've told me about the legacy of my work, both positive and negative, has given me a perspective on my career that I never had before." "Does that mean—" she started to ask, but her voice trailed off. "It means that I would be honored to work with you and your colleagues on this campaign," I said. "It means that you're absolutely right about the urgency of this work, and you're absolutely right that it needs someone with my experience to help make it successful." The conversation that followed lasted for 2 hours. Sarah introduced me to several of her colleagues, other neurodivergent individuals who were working on various aspects of the advocacy effort. We discussed strategies, timelines, and goals. We talked about the challenges we would face and the resources we would need. But more than the practical details, what struck me most was the passion, intelligence, and strategic thinking that Sarah and her colleagues brought to this work. These were people who had been personally affected by both the positive and negative applications of assistive technology, and they understood better than anyone what was at stake in the fight for cognitive accommodation. Over the next month, I worked with Sarah and her team to develop a comprehensive communication strategy for what we decided to call the Cognitive Liberty Campaign. The goal was to reclaim the original vision of assistive technology as a tool for accommodation and celebration of cognitive differences, rather than a pathway to normalization or medication. The campaign includes several components: research and documentation of both positive and negative trends in assistive technology, personal storytelling from neurodivergent individuals and families, policy advocacy aimed at protecting the rights of cognitive minorities, and public education designed to challenge misconceptions about autism, ADHD, and other conditions. But the centerpiece of the campaign is something Sarah suggested: a series of video testimonials from people whose lives have been transformed by cognitive accommodation. These testimonials don't focus on overcoming disabilities or becoming more normal. Instead, they celebrate the unique contributions that neurodivergent people make when they're given appropriate support and accommodation. The first video in the series features Sarah herself, talking about her experience as an autistic student who is thriving in advanced academics not despite her autism, but because of the ways her cognitive differences have been accommodated and celebrated. She talks about her research in computational linguistics, her plans for developing new assistive technologies, and her vision of a world where cognitive diversity is understood as a natural and valuable part of human variation. The second video features Sarah's mother, Dr. Linda Chen, discussing her journey from a non-speaking autistic child to a leading researcher in autism spectrum disorders. She talks about how assistive communication technology gave her a voice, but also about how the celebration of her cognitive differences gave her the confidence to pursue her dreams. Additional videos feature engineers, artists, entrepreneurs, teachers, and innovators who are succeeding not despite their cognitive differences, but because those differences have been accommodated and celebrated. These are people whose achievements demonstrate the value of cognitive diversity and the importance of assistive technology that supports, rather than suppresses, neurological differences. The response to the campaign has been extraordinary. Within weeks of launching, we had received hundreds of messages from neurodivergent individuals and families who felt seen and heard in ways they never had before. We had inquiries from schools, employers, and technology companies who wanted to learn more about cognitive accommodation. But more importantly, we began to see concrete changes in how assistive technology is developed and marketed. Several companies revised their products to focus more on accommodation and less on normalization. Insurance companies began covering a broader range of assistive technologies. Schools started implementing more comprehensive cognitive accommodation programs. The work is far from finished, and there are still powerful interests that benefit from the medical model of cognitive differences. But Sarah was right that this was urgent work that needed to be done, and she was right that it needed someone with my skills and experience to help make it successful. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that cognitive differences should be celebrated rather than eliminated, please subscribe to this channel and share your own experiences in the comments. The work Sarah and I are doing depends on building a community of people who understand that diversity of thought is a strength, not a weakness. Your voice matters in this conversation, and we need your help to continue changing how society thinks about neurodivergent people. More than that, though, what I want you to understand from Sarah's story is the power that each of us has to influence the world in ways we might never realize. The campaign I created in 1985 was just one project among many in my career, but it had consequences that rippled through decades and touched millions of lives. Sarah's letter taught me that we are all connected to each other in ways we rarely see or understand. The work we do, the values we promote, the visions we articulate, all of these things have the power to create worlds that future generations will inhabit. Sometimes, the most important letter you'll ever receive will come from someone you've never met, someone whose life you influenced without knowing it, someone who has been living in the world you helped create. My name is Eleanor Hartford. I'm 73 years old. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and I've learned that the most meaningful work of my life didn't happen in boardrooms or conference calls. It happened in the life of a 16-year-old girl who had the courage to write me a letter and tell me how my work had changed her world. Sarah Chen saw connections that I had missed, understood implications that I had never considered, and had the wisdom to know that sometimes the people who start revolutions need to be reminded that their work isn't finished. Her letter was indeed urgent, not just because of the immediate issues facing the neurodivergent community, but because it reminded me that we all have the power to create change in the world, and that power comes with the responsibility to use it wisely. Thank you for listening to this story. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you never know whose life you might be changing with the work you do today. Sometimes the most important person in your professional legacy is someone you haven't met yet, someone who will be living in the world you help create.